An old veteran tried to sell his metals for food. The pawn shop owner called them scrap. Everyone went quiet. Then a man stepped forward from the corner. It was Sylvester Stallone, and everything changed. Welcome to Stallone Unleashed. Let's uncover what really happened. The pawn shop sign, a faded, flickering neon relic, cast a lurid, intermittent glow on the rain-slicked pavement. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of stale cigarette smoke, desperation, and the faint, metallic tang of 1,000 forgotten histories. Shelves crammed with the detritus of broken dreams and urgent needs lined the walls. Tarnished jewelry, silent musical instruments, power tools bearing the scars of hard labor, and a myriad of objects whose stories were now reduced to a price tag. Behind a scarred wooden counter, a man with eyes like chips of flint and a perpetually cynical downturn to his lips appraised a small, velvet-lined box with practiced indifference. His name was Sal, and he'd seen it all, heard every hard luck story, every whispered plea. Nothing much surprised him anymore. Across the counter stood an older man, his shoulders slumped, his face a roadmap of hardship. He wore a threadbare army surplus jacket, too thin for the biting November wind that whistled outside. In his trembling hands, he held the open box, revealing a collection of military medals. A Purple Heart, a Bronze Star, several campaign ribbons. Each a testament to courage, to sacrifice, to a past that seemed a world away from this dingy emporium of last resorts. His name was Henry, and his eyes, though clouded with a weary shame, still held a flicker of the soldier he once was. Leaning against a dusty display case near the entrance, observing the quiet, desperate transaction, was another man. He was an unassuming figure, his weathered features and plain, dark clothing allowing him to blend into the shop's shadowy corners. He carried a small, canvas satchel, and his hands, calloused and strong, were tucked into the pockets of his worn jacket. This was Samuel, a man who knew the weight of such medals, the stories they held, the sacrifices they represented. He hadn't intended to enter the pawn shop. He'd been walking, seeking a brief respite from the city's relentless noise, when the sight of Henry, hesitating at the shop's entrance, had caught his eye. There was a dignity in the old soldier's bearing, even in his evident despair, that resonated with something deep within Samuel. He'd followed him in, a silent observer drawn by an instinct he didn't fully understand. "Not much call for these anymore, old-timer," Sal said, his voice flat, dismissive, as he poked at one of the medals with a grimy fingernail. "Scrap metal mostly. Sentiment doesn't pay the bills." Henry flinched as if struck. "They're not scrap," he said, his voice barely a whisper, hoarse with unshed tears. "They were earned." Yeah. Everyone's out of story," Sal grunted, already losing interest, his eyes scanning the shop for more promising prospects. $50 for the lot. Take it or leave it. $50. For a lifetime of service, for wounds sustained, for battles fought in forgotten places. The words hung in the stale air, a brutal summation of a life's worth in the cold calculus of the pawn shop. Henry's hand, holding the box, trembled more violently. He looked down at the medals, his gaze filled with a profound, aching sorrow. He needed the money. His small room was cold, his stomach empty. Pride was a luxury he could no longer afford. But this felt like a desecration, a final, bitter surrender. Samuel watched, his own heart constricting. He knew that look, the hollowed-out despair of a man, pushed to his absolute limit. He thought of a small, worn compass he carried in his own satchel, a memento from his own service, a reminder of a time when duty and honor were guiding stars. He saw Sal begin to turn away, to dismiss Henry as just another piece of human flotsam. And in that moment, something within Samuel, a quiet but unyielding sense of justice, of solidarity, compelled him to act. He pushed himself away from the display case, his movements slow, deliberate, yet imbued with an undeniable presence that made both Sal and Henry turn towards him. The flickering neon sign outside cast his face in shadow, but his eyes, steady and clear, held a quiet authority. "Excuse me," Samuel said, his voice calm, but carrying a resonance that cut through the shop's dreary atmosphere. Sal, annoyed at the interruption, shot him a sharp, appraising glance. Henry looked up, a flicker of surprise, perhaps even a sliver of hope, in his weary eyes. "Those medals," Samuel continued, his gaze fixed on the velvet-lined box in Henry's trembling hands, "they represent more than scrap metal." Sal snorted. "Look, pal, I'm running a business here, not a museum. You want M? You make an offer. Otherwise, step aside." Samuel ignored him, his attention focused entirely on Henry. He moved closer, slowly, his steps measured. He stopped beside the old soldier, not crowding him, but offering a silent presence of support. "May I?" Samuel asked gently, indicating the box of medals. Henry hesitated, then nodded, a flicker of trust dawning in his eyes. He seemed to draw a little strength from Samuel's quiet confidence. Samuel took the box, his calloused fingers handling the medals with a reverence that was a stark contrast to Sal's earlier, dismissive touch. He examined each one carefully. The deep purple of the heart, the bronze sheen of the star, the faded colors of the campaign ribbons. He recognized them all. He knew what they signified, the courage, the sacrifice, the often unseen wounds they represented. "This Purple Heart," Samuel said, his voice still low, but imbued with a deep respect, "was awarded for being wounded in action. It speaks of bravery under fire, of a willingness to lay down one's life for one's country." He looked at Henry. "Where did you serve?" Henry swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Korea," he rasped. "In Vietnam. Long time ago." Samuel nodded slowly. "2 wars. 2 tours through hell. And this was how his country repaid him, with hunger, with cold, with the desperate need to pawn his honor for a pittance." Sal, impatient, tapped his fingers on the counter. "Look, are we doing business here or what? I ain't got all day for a history lesson." Samuel turned his gaze on Sal, and for the first time, the pawn shop owner felt a flicker of unease. There was something in Samuel's eyes, a cold, hard glint of steel, that a man like Sal, who dealt in desperation, recognized and instinctively respected. It was the look of a man who had seen too much, endured too much, and would not be easily intimidated. "These medals," Samuel said, his voice dropping, becoming almost a growl, "are not for sale. Not for $50. Not for any price you could offer." He took out his wallet, a worn leather billfold that had seen better days. He extracted several bills, 50s, 20s, more money than Henry had probably seen in months. He placed them on the counter, not in front of Sal, but directly in front of Henry. "This is for you, soldier," Samuel said. "For your service. For your sacrifice." Henry stared at the money, then at Samuel, his eyes wide with disbelief, with a dawning, overwhelming gratitude. Tears welled, spilling Una shed down his weathered cheeks. I can't," he stammered. "You don't even know me." "I know enough," Samuel replied. "I know what those medals mean." He turned back to Sal, his expression unyielding. "As for you," he said, his voice like chipped flint, "you should be ashamed. These aren't trinkets. They're pieces of a man's soul, and they're not for pawning." The pawn shop, usually filled with the low murmur of transactions and the jingle of the bell above the door, had fallen utterly silent. The few other customers in the shop had stopped their browsing, their attention riveted on the quiet drama unfolding at the counter. Even Sal, for once, seemed at a loss for words, his usual cynical bravado momentarily deserting him. Samuel picked up the box of medals, closed it gently, and handed it back to Henry. "Keep these, brother," he said. "They belong to you. They are a testament to your honor." Henry clutched the box to his chest as if it were a lifeline, his shoulders shaking with emotion. He tried to speak, but no words came, only a choked sob. Samuel placed a hand on his shoulder, a gesture of solidarity, of shared understanding. The silence in the pawn shop was profound, broken only by Henry's quiet weeping and the distant, indifferent hum of the city outside. The atmosphere in the pawn shop remained thick with an unaccustomed silence. Sal, for once, seemed to have lost his voice, his usual bluster deflated by Samuel's quiet, unyielding authority. He stared at the money Samuel had placed on the counter for Henry, then at the two men, a mixture of resentment and grudging respect warring on his face. The other patrons, initially just curious onlookers, now seemed to hold a collective breath, witnessing a moment of unexpected, raw humanity in a place usually devoid of it. Henry, still clutching the box of medals, gradually regained some composure. He wiped his eyes with the back of a trembling hand, his gaze fixed on Samuel with an expression of profound, almost worshipful gratitude. I don't know what to say, Henry finally managed, his voice hoarse. No one's ever. No words needed, friend, Samuel said gently. He knew the depths of despair Henry had been plumbing, the crushing weight of feeling forgotten, invisible. He also knew the small, vital spark of dignity that could be rekindled by a simple act of recognition, of respect. He turned his attention back to the money on the counter. He pushed it closer to Henry. This is yours. No strings attached. Get yourself a warm meal, a decent place to stay for a few nights. Get back on your feet. Henry looked at the bills, then back at Samuel, a new light dawning in his eyes, a flicker of the fighting spirit that had earned him those medals so long ago. But why? He asked, the question a genuine plea for understanding. Why would you do this for a stranger? Samuel paused, his gaze distant for a moment, as if looking back through the long corridors of his own past. He thought of the compass in his satchel, a gift from a mentor who had taught him about duty, about looking out for one's comrades, about the unbreakable bonds forged in shared hardship. Let's just say, Samuel said, his voice quiet but firm, that we all have debts to pay, Henry. Some to our country, some to each other, and some to ourselves. He didn't elaborate, didn't offer any personal history. His actions spoke louder than any explanation. He picked up the small, velvet-lined box from where Henry had momentarily placed it back on the counter. He opened it again, his eyes lingering on the medals. These, he said, his voice resonating with a deep, almost sorrowful pride, are a reminder of what it costs to keep a nation free, a reminder of the sacrifices made by men like you. They should be displayed with honor, not hidden away in shame or sold for a pittance. He looked around the dingy pawn shop, his gaze sweeping over the shelves laden with forgotten treasures and broken promises. This is no place for them, he stated, a quiet finality in his tone. He then did something that surprised everyone, even Henry. He reached into his own satchel and withdrew a small, neatly folded flag, the stars and stripes, worn and faded but impeccably clean. He carefully unfolded it and laid it on the counter. Then, one by one, he took Henry's medals from the box and began to arrange them on the flag, his movements precise, respectful, almost ceremonial. The Purple Heart, the Bronze Star, the campaign ribbons, each found its place, a constellation of courage against the backdrop of the nation's colors. The silence in the shop deepened, becoming almost reverent. Sal watched, his mouth slightly agape, his usual cynicism momentarily forgotten. The other patrons drew closer, drawn by the quiet solemnity of Samuel's actions. It was as if a makeshift shrine was being erected in the heart of this temple of lost hopes. The arrangement of medals on the folded flag was a stark, poignant tableau. Each piece of metal, each strip of ribbon, seemed to reclaim its voice, its story, under Samuel's reverent touch. The tarnished silver and bronze gleamed dully under the shop's dim lighting, no longer mere commodities, but symbols of a profound, almost sacred history. Henry watched, his breath catching in his throat, tears streaming silently down his face now, not tears of shame, but of a bittersweet, overwhelming pride. It was as if he were seeing his own life, his own sacrifices, acknowledged and honored for the first time in many, many years. Samuel, having completed his task, stepped back slightly, allowing the display its full impact. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The medals, resting on the flag, spoke for themselves, a silent, eloquent testament to a soldier's duty, a nation's debt. One of the other customers, a young woman with kind eyes, who had been watching with growing emotion, reached into her purse and quietly placed a folded $20 bill beside the money Samuel had already given Henry. Then another customer, an older man in a work-worn jacket, did the same, adding a 10. Soon, a small pile of bills began to grow beside the flag, a spontaneous offering from strangers moved by Henry's plight and Samuel's quiet, dignified intervention. Sal, the pawn shop owner, looked on, his expression unreadable. The cynical mask had slipped, revealing a flicker of something else. Surprise, perhaps, or a long-dormant ember of conscience. He cleared his throat, a harsh, grating sound in the stillness. "Look," he began, his voice rougher than usual. "I got a display case in the back. Empty. Used to hold some fancy watches, but they sold a while back." He gestured vaguely towards a dimly lit corner of the shop. "It's got a lock and a light. If you want, you could put him in there. For people to see. Proper-like." It wasn't an apology, not exactly. But it was an offering, a concession, a grudging acknowledgement of the significance of what he had just witnessed. Samuel looked at Sal, then at Henry. Henry, his face streaked with tears but his eyes shining with a new light, nodded slowly. "Yes," he whispered. "I'd like that. I'd like that very much." Samuel then carefully gathered the flag with the medals still resting upon it. He carried it, almost like a sacred relic, towards the back of the shop, Sal leading the way, his usual swagger replaced by a new, awkward deference. The other customers followed, a small, impromptu procession. Sal unlocked the glass display case. It was dusty, but otherwise intact. He wiped it down with a rag he produced from under the counter. Samuel then gently placed the flag and medals inside, arranging them so they were clearly visible. He stepped back, and Sal switched on the small internal light. The medals gleamed, their colors suddenly more vibrant, their significance amplified by the unexpected setting. They were no longer items to be pawned, but artifacts to be honored. A small, quiet memorial in the heart of a place that usually dealt only in forgetting. Henry stood before the display case, his hand resting on the cool glass, his reflection staring back at him. A man seeing himself, perhaps for the first time in years, not as a failure, not as a burden, but as a soldier, a survivor, a man of honor. The silence in that corner of the pawn shop was profound, a shared moment of reverence that transcended the squalor and desperation of its usual commerce. Samuel had not just saved a man's medals. He had, in a small but significant way, helped to restore a measure of his soul. The transformation of that dusty corner of the pawn shop into an impromptu shrine had a palpable effect on everyone present. The other customers, who had contributed their own money, now stood looking at the display case with a quiet respect. Their earlier, casual interest had deepened into something more profound, a shared recognition of a story that resonated beyond Henry's individual plight. It was a story about sacrifice, about remembrance, and about the often overlooked dignity of those who have served. Sal, the pawn shop owner, seemed genuinely affected. He kept looking at the medals, then at Henry, then back at the display case, as if trying to reconcile this new, unexpected reality with the hardened cynicism he had cultivated for years. "You know," he said, his voice softer now, "my old man, he served too. World War II. Never talked about it much. But he had a box like that one." He gestured towards the medals. "Kept it in his dresser. Told me never to touch it." A flicker of a long-forgotten memory, a connection to his own past, seemed to surface in Sal's eyes. Perhaps, Samuel thought, even the most calloused hearts retained a spark of something human. Henry, bolstered by the unexpected outpouring of support and respect, stood a little taller. The weary slump in his shoulders had eased, replaced by a quiet, almost fragile dignity. He reached out and shook Samuel's hand, his grip surprisingly firm. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for seeing me. Every soldier deserves to be seen." "Henry," Samuel replied, and remembered. He then turned to the small pile of money that had accumulated on the counter. He gathered it up and pressed it into Henry's hand. "This is from all of us," he said. "Use it wisely. Find a warm place. Get some rest." Henry looked at the money, then at the faces of the strangers who had offered it, his eyes shining. I will, he promised. I won't forget this. Any of it. As Henry prepared to leave, Sal stepped forward again. Hold on a minute, old-timer, he said. He disappeared into the back room for a moment, then reemerged with a heavy, woolen blanket, still in its original plastic packaging. Found this in a box of unclaimed goods, Sal said, a little gruffly, as if embarrassed by his own generosity. Winter's coming. You'll need it. He thrust the blanket at Henry. Henry took it, his face a mask of stunned gratitude. Thank you, Sal, he stammered. Sal just shrugged, but there was a new light in his eyes, a hint of something softer, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. Samuel watched this exchange with a quiet satisfaction. He hadn't set out to change Sal or to inspire a wave of generosity. He had simply acted on his own principles, his own sense of what was right. But sometimes, he knew, a single act of integrity could have unforeseen ripples, awakening the better angels in others. As Henry, clutching his medals, his money, and the warm blanket, made his way towards the door, the other customers offered quiet words of encouragement, of respect. The atmosphere in the pawn shop, usually so fraught with desperation and regret, was for this brief interlude, filled with a sense of community, of shared humanity. Samuel knew this single act wouldn't solve all of Henry's problems, nor would it erase the years of hardship he had endured. But it was a start, a moment of grace in a harsh world, a reminder that even in the darkest of places, a flicker of light, of hope, could still be found or kindled. The small, worn compass in Samuel's satchel seemed to point, not north, but towards a deeper, more fundamental truth. The enduring importance of compassion, of standing up for those who have been forgotten. After Henry had left, a quiet sense of purpose seemed to settle over the pawn shop. Sal, surprisingly, kept the display case lit, the medals gleaming within, a silent testament to the day's events. He even found a small, handwritten card and, after a moment's thought, wrote on it, "Property of a hero. Not for sale." He propped it inside the case, next to the flag. The gesture, though small, spoke volumes. Samuel lingered for a few more minutes, watching as the shop slowly returned to its usual rhythm, yet with a subtle difference. The transactions seemed a little less harsh, the interactions a little more human. Perhaps, he mused, the presence of those medals, that small shrine to honor, would have a lasting effect, a quiet reminder of values that transcended mere commerce. As Samuel prepared to leave, Sal approached him, his usual cynical demeanor softened by an uncharacteristic hesitancy. Hey, mister, Sal began, fumbling for words. Thanks for, setting me straight. Sometimes a guy forgets. He trailed off, clearly uncomfortable with expressing anything resembling sentiment. Samuel simply nodded. We all forget sometimes, Sal. The important thing is to remember again. He offered his hand. Sal looked at it for a moment, then took it, his grip surprisingly firm. If that old soldier ever comes back, Sal said, tell him his stuff is safe here. No charge for the display. Samuel smiled faintly. I'll do that, Sal. He stepped out of the pawn shop and into the now darkened street. The rain had stopped, and the air was cold and clean. He felt a profound sense of weariness, but also a deep, quiet satisfaction. He hadn't sought confrontation, hadn't intended to make a grand statement. He had simply seen an injustice, a diminishment of a man's dignity, and he had acted. He thought of Henry, out there somewhere in the city, hopefully finding a warm meal, a safe place to rest. He knew the road ahead for the old soldier would still be difficult, but perhaps today, a small measure of hope had been restored, a small spark of self-worth rekindled. The memory of Henry's tear-streaked face, the dawning light of gratitude in his eyes, would stay with Samuel for a long time. He reached into his satchel, his fingers closing around the familiar, comforting shape of his old compass. It had guided him through many dark nights, through many uncertain terrains. Tonight, it seemed to have guided him once more, not through a physical landscape, but through a moral one. He walked on, a solitary figure disappearing into the city's shadows, leaving behind a pawn shop that was, for one day at least, a little less about desperation and a little more about honor. The flickering neon sign still cast its lurid glow, but inside, in a dusty glass case, a small collection of medals gleamed, a silent, enduring reminder of a soldier's sacrifice and of a stranger's quiet, profound act of compassion. The entire pawn shop had indeed been silenced, not by fear or intimidation, but by the unexpected, undeniable power of human decency. The following days brought a subtle but persistent change to the pawn shop. Sal, much to his own surprise, found himself glancing at the display case frequently. The medals, under their small light, seemed to exude a quiet dignity that permeated the usually sordid atmosphere of the shop. Customers, too, would often pause before it, their curiosity piqued, sometimes asking Sal about the story behind them. And Sal, shedding some of his habitual gruffness, would recount, in his own terse way, the events of that afternoon. He wouldn't mention his own initial callousness, but he would speak of the old soldier and of the quiet, unassuming stranger who had stepped in. The story, in its telling and retelling, seemed to take on a life of its own, a small legend woven into the fabric of the shop. Samuel, meanwhile, didn't forget Henry. He made discreet inquiries through some old service contacts, men who, like him, understood the often invisible struggles of veterans who had fallen through the cracks. It took some time, some patient persistence, but eventually he found Henry. The old soldier was staying at a small, clean shelter run by a local veterans aid group, a place Samuel's contacts had helped him secure. The money from the pawn shop and the generosity of strangers had given him a crucial breathing space. When Samuel visited, Henry was almost unrecognizable. He was clean-shaven, his clothes were neat, and though the lines of hardship were still etched on his face, his eyes held a new clarity, a flicker of his old, indomitable spirit. He was even helping out in the shelter's kitchen, his carpentry skills, though rusty, proving useful in repairing a wobbly table. "Samuel," Henry exclaimed, his face breaking into a wide, genuine smile when he saw him. "I hoped I'd see you again." They sat and talked for a long time, not about the wars, not about the hardships, but about simpler things, the changing seasons, the taste of good coffee, the quiet satisfaction of a job well done. Henry spoke of his plans, his hopes of perhaps finding a small room of his own, of maybe even getting back to some light woodworking. The despair that had clung to him like a shroud in the pawn shop was gone, replaced by a fragile but determined optimism. Before Samuel left, Henry pressed a small, intricately carved wooden bird into his hand. "I made this," Henry said, a touch of his old pride in his voice. "Found some scrapwood here. It's a thank you for everything." Samuel recognized the bird's species immediately. It was a knot-winger, a symbol of resilience he himself cherished. He was deeply moved. "It's beautiful, Henry," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll keep it always." He placed it in his satchel, alongside his own compass. Two small tokens, one of guidance, one of endurance, now companions on his journey. He didn't tell Henry about his own knot-winger, nor about the similar bird that had played a role in another story, another life touched. Some connections, he knew, were best left unspoken, their power residing in their silent resonance. As he left the shelter, Samuel felt a profound sense of peace. He hadn't solved all the world's problems, hadn't erased all injustice, but he had made a difference in one man's life. And sometimes that was enough. He knew Henry's journey was far from over, but he also knew the old soldier now had a fighting chance, his dignity restored, his spirit rekindled. A few weeks later, Samuel found himself walking past the pawn shop again. He paused, looking through the grimy window. He saw Sal behind the counter, engaged in a transaction with a customer. But his eyes were drawn to the back of the shop, to the small, lit display case. The medals were still there, gleaming softly, a quiet beacon of honor in the midst of the shop's clutter. As he watched, Sal concluded his business and then, almost as if drawn by an invisible thread, walked over to the display case. He stood before it for a moment, his expression unreadable, then reached out and gently wiped a speck of dust from the glass. It was a small gesture, almost insignificant, but to Samuel, it spoke volumes. It suggested that the events of that day had left a mark, not just on Henry, but on Sal as well. Perhaps even the most cynical of hearts could be touched, however briefly, by an act of genuine compassion. Samuel didn't go in. There was no need. His work there was done. He continued on his way. The two small wooden carvings, the compass and the knot winger, resting in his satchel, silent reminders of the interconnectedness of lives, of the quiet battles fought and sometimes won, not with weapons, but with empathy, with integrity, with the unwavering belief in the inherent worth of every human soul. He knew there would be other Henrys, other Sals, other moments when he would be called upon to stand for what was right. It was not a burden, but a quiet purpose, a guiding principle as reliable as the old compass he carried. The city hummed around him, a vast, indifferent entity. But Samuel walked through it with a steady tread, his gaze clear, his heart, though weathered by his own share of storms, still capable of profound empathy. He was a keeper of forgotten stories, a quiet champion of lost causes, a man who understood that true wealth was not measured in dollars and cents, but in the currency of human dignity, a currency he was always willing to spend and to defend. The memory of Henry's medals, rescued from oblivion, and the subsequent silence that had filled the pawn shop, a silence not of emptiness, but of profound, shared humanity, would remain with him, a quiet testament to the enduring power of a single, principled stand. The story of Henry and the medals did not end there, though Samuel was not privy to all its chapters. He heard, through his veteran contacts, that Henry, with the help of the aid group, eventually found a small, subsidized apartment. He started volunteering regularly at a local community center, teaching basic woodworking skills to at-risk youth. His gnarled hands, once trembling with despair, now steady and purposeful, guiding younger hands in the art of creation. The community center even helped him set up a small workshop in a converted storage room, and soon the scent of freshly cut pine and cedar began to fill the air, a fragrant testament to his renewed sense of purpose. Occasionally, Henry would visit the pawn shop, not to sell anything, but to look at his medals, still gleaming in their display case. Sal, surprisingly, always greeted him with a gruff sort of respect, sometimes even offering him a cup of coffee from the battered percolator he kept in the back room. They would talk, not for long, just two men from different worlds, sharing a brief, unspoken understanding forged in an unexpected moment of grace. The display case became a permanent fixture in the shop, a quiet point of honor amidst the clutter. Other veterans, hearing the story, would sometimes come in just to see it, to pay their respects. It became a small, unlikely touchstone, a reminder that even in the most mercenary of environments, a space could be made for dignity, for remembrance. Samuel never returned to the pawn shop himself. He didn't need to. He carried the essence of that day within him, in the form of Henry's knot winger, a constant reminder of the resilience of the human spirit and the profound impact of a single, compassionate act. His own compass continued to guide him, leading him to other quiet battles, other forgotten souls in need of a voice, of an advocate. He remained an unassuming figure, a man who preferred the shadows to the spotlight, his work done not for recognition, but from a deep, abiding sense of justice and empathy. He understood that true heroism often lay not in grand, public gestures, but in the small, consistent acts of kindness, of courage, of standing up for what is right, even when no one is watching, or when the world seems determined to look away. The silence that had fallen over the pawn shop that day had been broken by the quiet rustle of generosity, by the unspoken language of respect. And its echoes, Samuel knew, would continue to resonate, a subtle but persistent melody of hope in a world too often deaf to its own humanity. He continued his journey, a quiet guardian of such melodies, his own life a testament to the enduring power of a principled heart. The legacy of that afternoon in the pawn shop resonated in ways Samuel could never have fully anticipated. The small display case, initially a spontaneous gesture, became something of a local landmark, a testament to an unexpected moment of community spirit. Sal, though he would never admit it, found himself taking a certain pride in it. He kept the light on, the glass clean. It changed subtly the way he did business. He was still a shrewd negotiator, but a flicker of something softer, more human, would occasionally surface, especially when dealing with those who were clearly down on their luck. The story, passed along through the neighborhood, inspired other small acts of kindness. The local diner started a pay-it-forward system for meals. The community center where Henry volunteered saw an increase in donations and volunteers. It was as if Samuel's quiet intervention had unlocked a wellspring of compassion that had been dormant, waiting for a catalyst. Samuel himself remained unaware of most of these ripples. He continued his solitary life, his path guided by his internal compass, seeking out those quiet corners where injustice festered, where dignity was threatened. He carried Henry's knot-winger alongside his own mementos, each a symbol of a battle fought, a connection made, a small piece of light brought into a shadowed world. He understood that his work was never truly done. There would always be more Henrys, more forgotten souls, more moments requiring a quiet but firm stand. But he did not despair. He found his strength not in the expectation of grand victories, but in the unwavering commitment to his principles, in the simple act of trying. The memory of Henry's transformation, from a broken man on the verge of pawning his honor to a man rekindled with purpose and dignity, was a powerful fuel. It was a reminder that no life was beyond redemption, no spirit so crushed that it could not, with a little help, a little compassion, learn to soar again. The silence in the pawn shop that day had been profound, a space where shame and desperation had given way to respect and generosity. It was a silence born not of emptiness, but of a shared, unspoken understanding of the profound value of a human life, of sacrifices made, of honor reclaimed. And Samuel, the quiet man with the weathered face and the steadfast heart, knew that fostering such silences, such moments of grace, was perhaps the most important work a man could do. He walked on, his canvas satchel holding not just his few belongings, but the weight and wisdom of the lives he had touched, a silent guardian in a world desperately in need of them.